It's 2027, and the worst-case scenario's finally arrived. A divided Ukraine, about half the size it once was, is staring down the barrel of another Russian invasion with thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of troops marching across the border toward Kyiv. This time, however, Ukraine is not alone. And from their bases in Poland, Romania, and within Ukraine itself, Europe's coalition of the willing surges into action. British, French, Spanish, Dutch, and German pilots go running to their fighters, just moments away from getting airborne and just hours away from resolving this crisis through sheer, crushing air power. At the tip of the spear, ready to move unseen and undetected whilst delivering hell upon those below, are hundreds of copies of the American-made F-35. It's a weapon so potent that it can devastate Russian air defenses, take out Russia's military jets, and leave the way clear for complete and total air supremacy. The first of the F-35 pilots heave themselves into the cockpit, engage the startup sequence, and nothing happens. The Americans back in Washington have revealed that they are on Putin's side. They've hit the kill switch they secretly installed in their most potent war machines, and now, without the support of those who created them, those machines are worth nothing. Kyiv is going to fall, and there's nothing that Europe can do to stop it. For now, that tale we've created is mere fantasy. If you're watching this in 2027, you can check the date below. We're recording this in early 2025. But from Europe to East Asia to the military headquarters of US allies across the globe, some of the world's brightest strategic minds feared that this could one day become a reality. The idea of a kill switch, a remote trigger that the Pentagon could use to disable military equipment America sold its allies, well, it remains a mere myth, a betrayal that the United States says it would never, ever actually commit. Yet as America's allies grow increasingly skeptical of the man in the Oval Office, they've begun to agree that their collective dependence on American weapons is a problem that must be addressed. The world is beginning to abandon America's military industry. So here's what's happening, and here's why it matters. Just before we continue with today's video, got a bit of a travel tip for you. Stop paying that $12 a day for roaming just so you can load up Google Maps and find your way wherever you're going in an unfamiliar city. Instead, you should use today's fantastic sponsor, Saily. Saily is an eSIM app that gives you mobile data in over 190 countries. And once you install that eSIM, you're done. And an eSIM is an eSIM. It's an electronic SIM. There's no need to fuss around with that little SIM card tray. When did they start making SIM cards so bloody tiny? Look, every time you cross the border, no need to mess with new eSIMs. You just land, you connect, and you move on with your life, which is fantastic. Their plans are way cheaper than what your carrier charges, and you can even get regional or global coverage. Plus, no more sketchy SIM vendors outside the airport, no more standing in line just to get your emails. It's super easy to use, it works instantly, you don't burn through your data, and just makes traveling that little bit less annoying. Get 15% off with the code WarFronts. Just download the Saily app or go to saily.com/warfronts. Again, that's code WarFronts for 15% off. And now back to today's episode. Since the peak years of World War II, America's status as a military superpower has been built upon three unshakable pillars at once. Pillar number one is America's sheer military might, a commitment to having either the most weapons, the best weapons, or both in any given area of warfighting. Pillar number two, that's America's ability to project power across the globe through logistics and carrier strike groups. Yeah, but also through military alliances that extend America's power through dozens of other nations at once. And pillar number three is America's military-industrial complex, a sheer capacity to design, develop, and produce an incredible volume of quality weapons that it can then export all across the world, thus strengthening both itself and its allies for the long term. Now, as ever, that first pillar of American might is rock solid. In the week that this very episode was written, the US announced not one, but two ultra-advanced 6th-generation fighter jets, each of which has the potential to become the most sophisticated aircraft in all of human history. From its naval vessels, to its vehicle-building capacity, to its newly rebuilt assembly lines to churn out ammunition, America's ability to win a head-to-head war against another nation is not in doubt. But those other two pillars, well, quite frankly, they're not what they once were. The United States still has ample foreign military bases, ample numbers of nations that are still formally its foreign partners, but confidence in the United States, and especially its weapons, is slipping rapidly. Take a look at Canada, where new Prime Minister Mark Carney has kicked off a broad and unprecedented shift away from the United States. According to Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, speaking to foreign press in mid-March of this year, Canada is in the process of negotiating with European officials toward a deal that would establish a joint defense alliance, military procurement arrangements, and more, leaving the United States behind. Canada has ordered a full review and probably an outright reconsideration of a $13.2 billion deal in US dollars of the very same F-35 fighter jet we mentioned at the start of today's episode. Canada has been expecting to procure 88 of the jets, replacing the other American jet it currently relies on for its own defense, the F-A-18 Hornet. Now, though, Canada is looking to step away from that deal and accept other, less advanced but non-American-made aircraft. The nation is looking to build up its own military-industrial capacity, both eliminating its reliance on the military-industrial might that its southern neighbor has used to cultivate alliances for so long, and potentially making other US allies more able to distance themselves from Washington too. Canada recently signed a deal with Australia to develop an over-the-horizon radar system worth another $4.2 billion US dollars. And for the first time in a very long time, the nation is giving real thought to strengthening a military that's long been neglected because of Canada's trust in its southern neighbor. And it's not just Canada that's having second thoughts. The nation of Portugal had also intended to pick up a batch of F-35s from America, replacing its 28 American-made F-16s, but the unpredictability of the current administration in Washington has led Portugal to reconsider. Said the nation's defense minister Nuno Melo to Portuguese news, quoting here, "The recent US stance in the context of NATO and the international geostrategic dimension makes us think, what are the best options? Because the predictability of our allies is a factor to be reckoned with." Portugal has turned its attention toward picking up European jets of various models. The nation of Denmark has been even more explicit about its own F-35 purchase, said parliamentarian Rasmus Jarlov, former head of the government's defense committee in late March, quoting here, "As one of the decision-makers behind Denmark's purchase of F-35s, I regret it. Buying American weapons is a security risk that we cannot run. We will make enormous investments in air defense, fighter jets, artillery, and other weapons in the coming years, and we must avoid American weapons if at all possible. I encourage our friends and allies to do the same." Denmark is currently in possession of 17 F-35s out of a total order of 27. French President Emmanuel Macron has called on the European Union to stop purchasing US equipment wherever possible, instead shifting toward European-made weapons and eliminating NATO's dependency on its most powerful member. Macron oversees France's own considerable military-industrial complex and has worked to break down procedural barriers that would get in the way of France rapidly stepping up its own production. German officials have told national press that they suspect that the US really does have a kill switch inside its F-35 fighters, and an increasing number of defense voices in the country are advocating that Germany rethink its use of the fighter jet. Even without a kill switch, American export controls make it so that nations that use the F-35 are all but unable to modify or maintain them without US support in a system that's also used by the US in regard to other weapon systems. There's been some pushback within Europe, most prominently Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson's statements in mid-March that he did not consider it a risk to buy US weapons, and Germany's decision a few weeks later to buy F-35s to replace its aging strike aircraft. But even Sweden's Kristersson advocated shifting away from dependence on the United States anyway, and Germany only intends to use the F-35 as one part of a much larger combat air wing. And it's not just Europe and Canada that are seeing confidence in Washington start to slip. Taiwan is almost entirely reliant on the United States for its armed procurement need, a situation that isn't likely to change. But according to a recent War on the Rocks analysis, Taiwan has been crippled by frequent delays in delivering American hardware that Taiwan badly needs. The island is under intense pressure from the United States to boost its defense spending, but according to the War on the Rocks analysis, Taiwan isn't able to grow its defense budget until US arms suppliers get themselves together. Longtime US ally South Korea has spent the last several years growing into a defense industrial powerhouse and has actually started jumping into the gap that America has left in other nations, most recently making overtures to Canada and offering weapons from a non-American source. At the same time, the nation's government appears to be seriously considering the idea that South Korea would develop its own nuclear deterrent. Even the Philippines is in the process of moving away from US hardware within its arsenal and isn't expected to purchase much in the way of American weaponry in the future. Indeed, the concerns shared among an increasing proportion of America's allies go far beyond the simple idea of a kill switch. Could Washington, in some hypothetical world, press a magic button and immobilize some of its most advanced tech abroad? Maybe. Maybe not, but while the answer does matter, it's not the most important motivator for the shift happening across the globe. America's allies are losing their confidence in America and its entire military-industrial complex, not just a certain piece of hardware. And in fact, they're so eager to distance themselves from the US that in cases like the F-35, they'd let go of the only fifth-generation stealth aircraft they have any hope of purchasing in favor of European-made or other options that, while formidable, are a major and indisputable step down in capability. They'd let go of a reliance on America's industrial might in favor of countries and regional defense economies that are very obviously unable to fill the gap anytime soon. For so many nations, all at once, to be willing to take a step down in their capabilities at a time of rising tensions across the globe, it's truly stunning. Alright, so what is actually happening here? Why are America's allies losing faith in Washington? And is this all just a panic about nothing? Go case by case, and we can certainly pinpoint reasons that individual US allies would be a little pissed off at Uncle Sam. In Canada, for example, we'll just quote Prime Minister Carney's remarks to government leaders on the 27th of March. The old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperations, is over. The United States, and particularly the administration of Donald Trump, has repeatedly threatened to annex Canada as a 51st state over the last several months, something that's led to a reinvigoration of Canadian nationalism in opposition to the idea on a level not seen in generations. Not only that, but America has hit Canada, one of its closest allies and trading partners, with major tariffs against Canada's oil and manufacturing industries, the two cornerstones of its export economy. Those tariffs followed a much longer willy-wonky series of threats by Trump against both Canada and Mexico. Canadian skepticism of the US is growing far beyond just the defense industrial realm, but to trust the US as a defender of Canada in this moment appears to simply be a bridge too far. In Europe, rising distrust of Washington is tied closely to Trump's approach to Ukraine, derided across much of the continent as both a betrayal of Kyiv and a naive, utterly foolish decision to place any level of trust in Vladimir Putin. When in late February, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was berated in what appeared to be a planned rhetorical ambush by both Trump and US Vice President J.D. Vance, American leaders' conduct was widely seen as a betrayal of Ukraine by European NATO members. A few weeks later, a survey across NATO nations showed that just half of all Poles, 45% of Germans, and barely a third of Brits believed that the US would actually honor its commitment to collective defense under the NATO alliance and come to defend a fellow NATO member if it were attacked. Only 1 in 3 Canadians in the same survey believed American Article 5 commitments to be credible. American demands that European nations hike their defense spending have been taken quite poorly, owing to the fact that most European nations are already stepping up spending, suggesting that Washington's new demands either suggest the US isn't paying attention or is looking for pretext not to defend Europe when the time comes. Trump's coziness with unsavory figures and autocrats from Putin to Xi to Erdogan to Vucic and more certainly haven't endeared him to European leadership, and nor of his outright threats to take the Danish territory of Greenland by force. America's diminishing credibility extends even beyond NATO. On the campaign trail in 2024, Trump refused to firmly commit to America's long-standing vow to defend Taiwan from Chinese invasion. Now, we here at WarFronts know our own comment section fairly well, and at this point, a fair number of viewers have almost certainly made a few different claims. Trump is just doing this to force European leaders to step up. He's only joking about annexing Canada or invading Greenland, and it's not the United States' job to be paying for the defense of other nations. This isn't just a call-out of our own viewers. By the way, these are very common arguments in the United States in support of the Trump administration and its approach to world politics. To put it politely, however, each of those arguments is seriously lacking, and the elements they fail to take into consideration are the same ones pushing America's allies away. On the first point, in Trump trying to force America's allies to step up their own defense, the difference between encouraging and forcing allies to do this really does matter. Nations that are allied with each other in anything resembling the usual status quo have a reasonable expectation that their ally isn't going to start leveraging the living out of them all of a sudden when options for level-headed communication still exist. That's not just a matter of pride either. Nations and national leaders have things like budgets, obligations to their own people, predetermined priorities, and more, and forcing a sovereign nation to compromise its own interests in order to serve some other country is, by definition, what enemies do. Telling, say, the nations of NATO that they've got to spend 5% of GDP on defense might sound like Trump laying down the law, but in practice it means wrestling many tens of billions away from other important priorities against the will of not just a nation's leaders, but the people who elected those leaders to manage the nation. It's really important for a country, no matter what country we're talking about, to ensure that it isn't subject to that sort of leveraging, no matter who's doing the leveraging. And historically, the United States' most potent instrument of leverage other than nuclear weapons has been its military-industrial complex. Through its Article 5 and other mutual defense guarantees, its provision of advanced weapons, and the reliance of other nations on its defense capabilities, the US has exercised leverage, or soft power, on its allies for decades. That's a system that those allies have tolerated, but can't tolerate if it's going to be outright abused. At the risk of making perhaps an unsavory comparison, there's a pretty massive difference between taking your dog for a walk and picking it up by the leash. Then there's the idea that Trump's threats aren't serious, to which we would ask, how are these other nations supposed to know that? The response to that question typically tends to be some version of, oh, it's obvious when he's telling a joke, get a life, bro, maybe touch some grass. But really, that's not good enough. The international order is built on the idea of signaling that a given nation, through either words or actions, can send clear, reliable signals to other countries so that those countries can make their own decisions about how to act. Within that system, there is not room for nations to just decide that a signal some other country is sending can be taken as unserious because that's what the vibes suggest. It's not so simple as saying, for example, that a president or another world leader just isn't allowed to joke. If a world leader says, for example, this is a joke, then they are effectively signaling that they are telling a joke. The trouble is ambiguity. If a nation has the option to either assume that the thing that sounds like a threat really is a threat or to dismiss it as being inconsequential, then think about the potential costs of getting that assessment wrong. If, say, Canada takes Trump's 51st state joke too seriously and it turns out to be nothing, then okay, Canada gets a bit of egg on its face. If Canada doesn't take the 51st state thing seriously enough, then Canada gets invaded and annexed. It's the same dilemma for European nations worried that America won't show up and defend them if they're behind on spending, or for Taiwan or South Korea worrying that Trump might decline to honor pledges of defense that modern Taiwanese and South Korean sovereignty is based around. In fact, it's the same dilemma when you consider the idea of a kill switch embedded into top-of-the-line US equipment. Maybe America does build in a kill switch, maybe it doesn't, but it might. And it doesn't seem like Washington would tell anybody straight if it did. So, are you, as a foreign country, really going to take that risk? In each of those cases, the response is the same. If America is going to be unpredictable and might not come through when it matters, then don't trust America as a defense partner, and don't trust its weapons either. And finally, let's talk about the idea that it's not the United States' job to be funding the defense of other nations. Now, we at WarFronts have made no secret of our own desire to see US allies stand on their own 2 feet when it comes to defense. You can easily find past episodes in which we berate Britain about exactly that. Or if Britain isn't enough, you can also find us berating basically all of Europe. Yet, for these nations to manage their own national defense, as Trump and his allies are urging, it's not enough for them to simply train more soldiers and have more military parades. They've got to build and refine their own defense industrial capacity too, and that's something that runs contrary to US interests in several ways at once. As we've mentioned, the US has made such a point of providing weapons to its allies because that really does grant America leverage and power that it can use later. It also fuels a booming defense export industry in America, worth a record $318 billion in 2024 and constituting one of the few industries where American manufacturing hasn't been outsourced. It also collaborates with many of these same nations to build its best military technologies, including the F-35, where the UK, Italy, and Japan have also contributed essential components. And finally, if the US has enemies abroad, then one would think the US makes itself safer by ensuring that a whole bunch of friends who share American interests and have their own high-quality American arms can stand up to those adversaries before they reach American soil. If those nations move away from American weapons, they might or might not be stronger in the long run, but they'll lose a valuable incentive to ally with America. Of course, the decisions made by Washington, D.C. are Washington's own, but in the meantime, and in response to their decisions, the rest of the world has to act. China is increasingly showing signs that it's ready to close in on Taiwan. Russia appears neither interested in a true peace in Ukraine nor ready to sacrifice its ambitions, and the United States, so long the linchpin of the entire Western world order, no longer appears committed to its allies. Faced with this writing on the wall, every one of these nations has only two options to choose from. Hope for the best and risk getting shafted, or expect the worst and use the resulting wake-up call to guide their approach to the future. This is something American defense contractors already understand, said one unnamed defense executive to the Financial Times in late March, quoting here, "I am concerned that pure politics could damage our prospects in future competitions." Yet it appears that that's exactly what's going to happen if the US remains on its current course. The difficult reality underlying all this is that neither Canada, nor Europe, nor East Asia has the facilities to readily replace American military equipment with their own, or to readily address the manufacturing shortfalls that would result. The thing about having relied on the US for defense industrial support for all this time is that these nations have seen their own defense industrial bases collect cobwebs on the expectation that their relationship with America was secure. Apparently, it's not, and that new reality does present some problems, but it also forces those nations to seek out new and innovative solutions. Let's start with defense production, where Canada in particular is given an interesting indicator of where things might go. If you remember back to Canada's overtures to European nations, not just to create defense alliances, but to consider relying on Canadian production capacity, that matters. Canada is a major global manufacturing center where reduced demand in the United States due to tariffs, especially on cars, suggests that new assembly lines may soon be going vacant. Canada doesn't really have much in the way of its own weapons designs, but it has the capability to build weapons and warfighting equipment if properly shown how. Europe has the opposite problem. Lots of bright defense industrial minds, some pretty cool designs, but a very sluggish defense industrial sector. So let's stick with the example of fighter aircraft, since the example of the F-35 that introduced us to this whole problem. The nations of Europe don't have a comparable fifth-generation fighter aircraft that can match the capabilities of the F-35. They've got multiple sixth-generation fighter aircraft programs, but those have yet to produce known, flyable prototypes. What Europe does have, however, are a series of combat aircraft that are quite possibly the best in the world, aside from stealth fighters. Those include France's Rafale, particularly the F4 upgrade series that's about to roll out, Sweden's Saab Gripen, particularly the highly advanced EF variant, the Eurofighter Typhoon, particularly the highly modernized Tranche 4 version, which is expected to serve well past 2060. But France can only produce 3 Rafales per month in 2025. The Typhoon assembly line only churns out about 10 aircraft per year, and between Sweden and a secondary assembly location in Brazil, only about 30 of those come off the line annually. But imagine a world in which, even if by necessity rather than choice, France, Sweden, and the Eurofighter Consortium provided their schematics to Mark Carney and kindly asked Ottawa to go crazy. It would take time to get everything ready, but once that happened, Canadian manufacturing would likely add major production capacity on top of what Europe already builds. And if these nations have to choose between that difficult task and the even less appealing choice of simply not being able to defend themselves, they'll choose the hard task. So too, would a military-industrial pivot away from the United States bring the potential to rejuvenate the European arms industry. European leaders and parliamentarians have been calling for increased production for years now, but as a range of European defense companies have tried to explain, those calls don't actually mean anything if new production contracts and cash infusions aren't coming in. For a while now, Europe has procrastinated and dithered on taking that final leap, but already it appears that more decisive action is imminent. Start putting their money where their mouths are, and Europe's assorted governments can kickstart a rebirth of their defense industries. Again, not painlessly, but with a hell of a lot more benefit in the end than they'd get by doing nothing. And just like Canada, other nations that would be deeply disadvantaged by a US that are reneged on its commitments could find ways to turn negatives into positives over time. South Korea is the most obvious example, hard at work building a booming defense industry that it hopes to build into one of the world's largest arms exporters. In the short term, American disengagement means vulnerability in the face of threats posed by North Korea and China. In the long term, however, with a range of nations from Europe to South Asia to Latin America pouring money into the country, South Korea might even be able to expedite its rise as the world's new arms dealer. Whether we're talking about tanks, ships, planes, or artillery shells, the maths works basically the same. In the short term, breaking away from American military equipment comes with costs, risks, shortfalls, and an urgent, unwelcome need to change these nations' economic priorities and meet the moment. That's not something that any of those nations want to do. After all, if they did want to do it, they would have done it a long time ago. Instead, they could keep up a balance with the United States that served everybody well enough. Allied nations accepted a position under the influence of American soft power, and in exchange, they got to outsource much of their approach to defense in order to focus on other matters. But now it appears that the United States is intent on disrupting that relationship, almost for the sake of disruption itself. It's not that the idea of production shortfalls or the risk of attack by a foreign power somehow got more appealing to Canada or Germany or South Korea. Instead, the problem is there's no longer a way to ensure that the United States will remain a reliable, trustworthy partner in the future, and in fact, when these other nations have tried to explain that they're attempting to do what America asks, America's current administration hasn't really seemed to care. And finally, we want to turn back to our beloved comment section below, because as we're sure a portion of Washington's defenders have now observed, this is exactly what the Trump administration seems to want. If America's many allies can finally get together and figure out how to stand firm on their own 2 feet militarily, then all the bluster and bullying got Washington exactly what it was hoping for. Right? And in a way, yeah, that's exactly right. The US is looking for those nations to increase their spending, build their militaries, and become more capable without US assistance, and that would certainly have happened. The trouble, however, is that by taking this particular approach to get to that set of results, the United States writes itself out of the international order. Granted, the United States' trade relationships, its military power, and its broader role in geopolitics ensure that it won't become irrelevant during our lifetimes, or even close. But for the better part of a century, the US has used its military-industrial leverage to become the captain at the helm of the ship, steering its entire network of alliances on a course through history that America chose. Now look, we're not going to argue that the world was better for it or the world was worse for it, but we've got to emphasize that the US only secured and kept its role as a dominant world power because it went out of its way to make itself indispensable. It spent a bit of the incredible wealth it's had available to burn. It suffered the occasional petty indignity and the feeling of doing more than everybody else because of the profound benefits of positioning itself at the center of the world. And it's here where we find the deeper significance of America's allies shifting away. As we've laid out, the path forward for these nations isn't for Canada or France or South Korea to simply go it alone, but instead to band together into alliances that all of them are still interested in keeping. The only difference now is that they're not incentivized to put America at the center, but to make America irrelevant. That's not simply because it might feel good to deal an insult to Washington, but because an alliance that incorporates this version of America is inherently unstable. Today, the nations of the global West are starting to figure out ways to maintain an international defense architecture without US involvement. If that works, it'll be on to diplomacy. If that works, it'll be on to trade. Never really choosing to simply disassociate from the US or become its enemy, but always working to make sure that the whims of an American leader don't suddenly become everybody else's problem. Perhaps, after a decade or two, those new alliances and international bonds still won't be as strong or as militarily capable as they would be if America was at the center. But perhaps in a decade or two, these nations' judgment will hold true, that being in an alliance that's safe from American meddling is worth the price they pay in somewhat diminished military power. It's cute to believe that an era of great power competition ended at the conclusion of the Cold War, but great power competition didn't start with the Cold War, and it didn't end there either. All throughout human history, some nations or alliances have grown their power, while others have diminished. And that's no different today. If the Cold War was, let's say, book number 50 in a series of stories, then we're reading book 51 right now, and we're coming up on a major inflection point. To be clear, none of this has to happen. The US could have chosen to strengthen its position as a world power and raise up its allies along with it. Instead, the US appears committed to a course in which its longtime partners have every incentive to ensure that their relationship with the US is one where the US has far less leverage than it used to. That process is starting in the defense world as we speak. And here at WarFronts, we'll be keeping a very close eye on that element of the story as it develops. But if this is where the world has moved already, not yet 3 months into a 4-year American presidency, then it's safe to assume that what we're seeing now is only the start. Thank you for watching.